it's a constantly changing list. It's and I've dealt in thousands of items, so it's always changing. I mean, I'm sure it's similar for you too, where it's always going to be changing.
Right, right. Yeah, for the longest time, my favorite piece in my collection was a James Whitey Bulger letter, handwritten letter, shortly after Black Mass, the movie about Bulger that Johnny Depp starred in, came out. There's this letter that I have that I still have it to this day, where he's talking shit about Johnny Depp, saying like the bastard tried to come and visit me. He made $20 million. I didn't get a dime of that. He can fuck
Mhm.
off. Blah blah blah. Like that's probably one of my favorite pieces. But as always, like you said, it's always changing. I mean, I had a couple Gacy paintings at one point, an Indian piece, probably one of the only unfinished paintings that Gacy's done. Completely ugly thing on pink velour paper, but yeah, I guess it just varies really. Like I have a Nazi war criminal letter from Iraq Pribki, which I find super interesting, and I've never really offered it for sale.
Mhm.
But that's probably one of my more interesting pieces that I have too. It's considering the fact that he passed away like 2 months after he had wrote me back, and it was
Mhm.
one of the last living, Nazi war criminals that was convicted, which is just kind of out of this world if you think about it.
Yeah, the one piece that kind of just slipped out of my hands that would definitely be the number one that I would have never sold is that I had paid Sam Little to do a pogo for me. So he was doing oil pastel drawings, and he was like his case got a ton of popularity sort of just before his death, right? So he killed 93 women. He's the most prolific killer in United States history. Um, and he was doing these oil pastel drawings for anybody who doesn't know, and the FBI was using them to close cold cases because he had a really good memory of what people looked like and he could draw it really well. I think they closed a good handful of cases based on the drawings that he had done for missing people that he had were his victims. And he, for a while, was sending these to people. He gave me one as a gift at one point, and then he asked if I wanted him to draw anything, and I said, "Yeah, I want to Pogo the Clown drawing." I sent him the photos. He was like, wrote me back, "Cool, I'll do it, no problem. It's gonna get done." And then he died, and then like 2 or 3 days later, I got a letter from him after he had died. So he must have written it and then died just afterwards, saying like, "Yeah, I'm working on it. It's almost done. I'll be sending it soon." So there's a half finished Pogo the Clown somewhere by Sam Little that probably got thrown out, but that would have been like, to get that in the mail, and it would have come right after he had died, and then to have that like I never would have done anything with that ever. But
Yeah, that would have definitely been a holy grail.
yeah, it's the one that got away.
If you could have anything from anyone in the world, dead or alive, who would it be and why? I know that's kind
um
of a hard one too.
yeah, and it changes a lot. This is like for I guess kind of normal everyday people, this is like, oh, what's your favorite song that's ever been released, or what's your favorite memory that you've ever had? Like, it's very hard to nail down. um for the longest time I wanted one of the Om Shinrikyo electroshock helmets. They had these weird, like, kind of mesh fabric helmets with electrodes that were used for meditation, that I always thought were super interesting. So I was very fascinated with them, and the things you can get from them are pretty. There's a lot of it out there, but specific stuff, right? It's hard to find those kind of unique one-off things like that. Um, it's one of those things where I'm convinced that eventually maybe I will find it, but it's just a brute force thing, right? Like I got to just wait and see. Um, yeah, there isn't. I mean, it would be cool to have an Ed Gein piece that had some real authenticity behind it. Not, and this isn't to say that anything out there is fake, but I've seen a lot of signatures where it's ripped off of a little paper, and the narrative doesn't make too much sense to me. I understand that these could totally be real things, but for me personally, I would be skeptical because if I had a letter from Ted Bundy, I wouldn't just rip the name off and frame it and then sell the little signature. I would keep the whole letter because it acts as its own kind of provenance for itself, right? Um, for Albert Fish as well, I've seen similar things where it's like a needle that was inside of him, or these little pieces, and it's one of those things where it could totally be real to a lot of people because somebody bought it, in the 80s and just sat around with it, and it never. But then the person they got it from, you never know where that came from, and the person before that. There's almost some of these items that become real based on the provenance of who they came from, but at some point you lose that kind of track of things, right? Um, I think it would be more so that I would want to be at certain events to be able to get these things firsthand, right? Like in the 80s, right after the Jonestown massacre, they had an auction of all their assets in San Francisco where they sold off all their buses, they sold off all their stationery, all the, Jim Jones podium was sold, everything in the People's Temple, and it was all sold for not next to nothing, because it was like people didn't want this dark, creepy stuff, right? I'm sure that somewhere in a scrapyard are sitting all the People's Temple buses that Jim Jones rode in. And that would be the thing where you could buy a seat from it and cut the seat into swatches, and that would be worth a ton of money, let alone everything else in there. That's one of them. Or being at the Heaven's Gate auction in 1999. And I've been lucky to get a lot of items from that. And I have other friends that have items, like one of the bunk beds, for instance. But if I can go back now in hindsight, there's so many things I would buy. Same thing with when you could buy a Pogo the Clown painting for $100 directly from Gacy, right? Out of the back of a comic book. Like, it's more so certain things that I would have wanted to be able to get certain things in certain places and at certain times. And now it's kind of a hindsight thing. But that's sort of, you could do that with anything, with that's the same thing. Way people look at their old Pokemon cards, right? And like, oh, I got rid of them, but they're worth tons now. I just try and be aware of that sort of stuff for current events or current items or current things where I know this is probably going to be one of those things that's not going to come around again. So I better get on it now, right?
Yeah, it's always been changing with me what I could have from somebody that's dead. But of course, like Albert Fish, Ed Gein,
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be really cool to have like one of the original Zodiac killer letters or the
Oh, for
Dear
sure.
Boss letter of Jack the Ripper. Or I mean, there's so much really out there that you could be like, I want this, this, and this. I mean, even going back to the 1800s, like a Lizzie Borden signature, or the Texarkana Phantom, or so many like Jack the Stripper. Even, I mean, so many like unsolved crimes. um
Yeah. Some furniture from inside of John List's house, that was seen in the crime scene photos, like stuff like that. Anything that I can directly connect to a photo or to a story or something. The Star Trek book that Armin Mivas read while he was sitting in his living room waiting for his victim to die, like just these specific detail pieces that are like so important to a case. I think the most recent thing that I've dealt with like that was the letter that Lionel Dahmer wrote to the judge when Jeff was in jail for molestation, saying, "Hey, don't let him out. Please get him some help. He needs help." Da 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 da. And then he got freed anyway, and then obviously went on to do stuff later. It was sort of his like cautionary thing, right? I've got that letter here somewhere, and then they talk about that in the series, so it's like a direct connection to to the case. But all those things are always really the grails, so to say.
um this is kind of worded weird. Is there anything in your collection that people did get that they regret purchasing? How do people feel about how do people feel about people slash family? Oh, how do people outside of your family feel knowing that they collect? Is there any issues that have caused personally, socially, or mentally? And most disappointing moment or aha moment in collecting?
This is a really good kind of series of questions. The first thing that comes to mind, so I bought these two T-shirts that were from the Picton farm. It's Robert Picton, Canadian serial killer, 49 victims. He's the local to my area, the most like notable Canadian serial killer of all time. Um, he used to have a music venue on his farm, and he would have shows and parties and all these things. And I met somebody locally who I ended up kind of dealing some Gacy items with, and he reached out and said, "Hey, I sold these two T-shirts to a guy, and he wants to sell them." Apparently, they had been found at a thrift store somewhere locally, sold to this dude as like a little novelty, like oddity thing. They were like event shirts for events they had on the farm. And then he bought those shirts, and then I got in touch with him and went to meet him, and we talked about it. And he was like, "Man, like I really want to get like I got to warn you before you get these. It's like bad luck." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he tells me, and he was a great guy. So I'm not trying to throw any shade at him, but he was like, "Well, I bought these shirts, and then shortly after that, I got addicted to hard drugs, and then I lost my job, and then I lost my girlfriend, and I ended up homeless, and was like, kind of going on about all these bad things that happened." And in my head, I was like, well, I understand why, you got this sort of negative thing and then all that happened. But I'm pretty sure that, when you got involved in hard drugs might have been the catalyst to a lot of these things, as opposed to the two t-shirts you bought secondhand, like it just makes more sense to me. But for whatever reason, that was the dark thing that caused this downfall for this person. Then I got them and I never had any kind of negative anything from them, right? They're just shirts as far as I'm concerned. Um, yeah, that was his experience with it, of like, I just want to get rid of this shit. For you, has that happened anything or?
No, not that I can really think of, to be honest.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people that are like not interested in the stuff. Who you might be like, yeah, I don't want this shit. It's too spooky for me. It's dark. I don't care about it. But never like a real story behind it. Um, when it comes to that kind of negative stuff from people online, I get that a lot. But from like friends, from people I know in real life, it's never really an issue. Um, my family thinks it's interesting. They're just kind of happy that I'm doing a job that I like. They don't really care too much. Friends, a lot of people think it's interesting. I've had a few people be like, "Oh, this is really cool. It's really neat to hear about this." The local bar I go to where the bartenders like hearing stories about new stuff that I get because they're interested in it. Mostly positive feedback in real life, I should say. Um, I think even if people did have an issue, it's people just kind of don't bring it up.
When I first started collecting and selling back in 2010, my family and friends all thought it was weird and like, you need to find a different hobby because you're going to end up taking your own life or taking somebody else's life, whatever. But as I got more and more into it, people were more, I guess, content with it and like, oh, okay, this is like an actual real hobby turned business.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't just like you're like glorifying serial killers and rapists and pedophiles, whatever. Like,
Yeah.
and then as I started the podcast, people are more and more in tune with it, I guess, and are more like okay with the fact that I collect murderabilia, talking to these people, actually getting something out of these prisoners, like their stories, and whether it be, you know, people analyzing this or helping somebody in some way, shape, or form. Um, but I've never really had any like super negative experiences with family or friends when it comes to like collecting this stuff or selling this stuff. I
Yeah.
think people are pretty open minded in my family and friends and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot. I mean, you gotta be pretty close minded to be like, oh, you're just like a weird whatever. Like, I mean, there's different books and this and that you can learn about murderabilia nowadays. It's not like a
Mm-hmm.
closed off hobby. Like you can actually learn about it educationally now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big criticism that I got from people a lot, and this is not real life, this is online stuff, but people being like, you're just glorifying this and da 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 da, and then but those people also being like really interested in true crime documentaries or podcasts or whatever, and they would be like, well, this is educational, and it's like to an extent, but these people are just retelling a story that's already out there and making money off that same story. Whereas now in this, I've worked with tons of documentaries and tons of media outlets on licensing never before seen photos and audio and video and letters and things that nobody's ever seen before, and I'm bringing new information about a lot of these cases to the world. Whereas somebody who writes a new book on Dahmer or a new book on Jonestown or whatever, yeah, when it comes to things like Jonestown or Jeffrey Dahmer or big cases, people have already told the story in one way or there's a book out there already, and there's more books written from those books, and there's podcasts made from those books, and there's documentaries made from those podcasts, and there's dramatizations made from those documentaries, and it's all just the same information over and over and over again. It's educational in the sense that it's reaching a new audience, but it's the same things. And I've worked with documentaries and TV shows and media companies on licensing information and stuff that nobody's ever seen. And so of you bringing new information to the public. So criticism I faced was just like, oh, we shouldn't be glorifying this. And it's like, I get that, but these outlets are glorifying it, whereas we are making actual new information public based on these things, right?
Right. And one issue that I have with that is I get a comment like every once in a while on my YouTube channel, like, how dare you give this man or woman a platform to talk about their crimes, whatever. But in reality, there's documentaries and movies and other podcasts that are regurgitating the information, literally making thousands or tens of thousands or millions of dollars a year when I'm just
Mm-hmm.
making, pennies on the dollar. And like you said, putting new information out there. It's not like I'm regurgitating this dude's case when I have this dude actually, whether he's lying or telling the truth or not, that's open to interpretation because, of course, psychopaths lie and sociopaths lie, and that's open to
Mm-hmm.
interpretation. But I feel like putting something new out there is more beneficial than just regurgitating something. But then again, that's just me. Like I believe in, putting getting new information out there, whether it be murderabilia or interviews or what have you. But I still enjoy listening to other true crime podcasts. I'm not knocking, true crime podcasts that like to cover cases, because it's certainly interesting and entertaining at
Oh, for
times.
sure. In the same way, it's yeah, it's not a matter of being against any of that. It's just the contradiction that people don't realize they're perpetuating. It's because everybody wants to take their own individual status on what's morally okay for them, and that's totally fine to feel that way. But it doesn't really, it's not going to change how you or I feel about it or anything else. Um, what was that last little? There was a one little last thing in that question, I think, too. Or did we cover that?
Um, oh, most disappointing moment or aha moment in collecting?
That's really cool. I don't know. I've had things where I've gotten things in the mail and I realize, fuck, this is definitely fake. And I have like a little folder here actually on my desk of like, how like a bodega will have fake bills taped up on the wall, being like, we don't take counterfeits, da 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 da. It's like that for my stuff, right? Um, I probably, over 5 years doing this, maybe 5 grand I spent on items that weren't legitimate, whether that was the person trying to scam me or the person not being aware and they got scammed. Um, and I'm very, very, very cautious about that kind of stuff now. Um, have a lot more awareness of it. But yeah, and when it comes to the aha moments, it's kind of like there's certain times where I found certain websites. I think that would be a big thing, or a website where like, oh, I can buy this thing here in either large quantities or renewable quantities, or I have access to a certain source for a certain thing or to a certain person based on one bit of research I did, right? Where I find the contact and that person puts me in touch with somebody or gets me what I need. Um, but that's, it doesn't happen too often. It's just like that's kind of the goal, is to build these contacts and this network for that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, I've been ripped off. I mean, more than enough times since 2010.
Mm-hmm.
There was a few years ago, I sent this dude $1,000. Family and friends, and he had so many different items that were. I knew that they should have been too good to be true. Like the Jam Master Jay's killers, they were arrested. Like a Dylan Roof County Jail letter. A just what was her name? The Supreme Court justice that passed away a few years ago. Ruth Gator Ben, however you say her
RGB, yeah.
name. There was
Mm,
so many items, and then yeah, blocked like not even 5 minutes later after I sent $1,000. So that's definitely it's definitely heartbreaking when even if it's like $50 and you're expecting to get an item that you want, or you're reselling or whatever for your personal collection, and you get ripped off where it's fake. And that's just like the heart-wrenching feeling is just like, oh man. But
for sure.
it's almost like when you fall off your bike, you get back on and you
Yeah,
keep going and
you
going.
learn
It's
from
like,
it. All the money I've lost, I've learned from those experiences.
right, right. So I have one question left from viewers, and that is, what actually constitutes a true crime museum?
That's I was excited for this one. Yeah, well, and we'll go off of this one from that to also, why don't you start a true crime museum? We can both talk on that a bit, I think, because it's one of the things that I get asked about the most, and both of those things. So, what constitutes it? First, we'll go on that. It's subjective. Obviously, there's people who have personal collections in their home and they think that's a museum. There's places like the Museum of Death or Alcatraz East, which are museums on totally different scales, different calibers. There's people who do pop-up shows, galleries. Like if you've seen the documentary Collectors with Rick Stanton, they do a Wayne Henley um, like art show that seems pretty successful, and it's just like a small like weekend gallery show. That kind of counts as a museum as well. Or places like Hyena, which is like a gallery but also deals in outsider art and true crime stuff. It's so subjective. It's really subjective. And you could consider that historical archives, like the California Historical Society, has the largest collection of Jonestown stuff there is, People's Temple stuff, I should say. So that counts as a museum, but it's not presented as a museum. um, I think it really depends. The thing that I don't feel like is a museum, and this is a personal opinion, not anything definitive, but to me, when somebody has, bought items from your site and my site and a few other true crime sites and has their stuff displayed at their house, it's like it's their stuff at their house. It's their items, it's their possessions, it's their collection. and people want to market their own collection as if it was a museum or a potential future museum, which is, it's fine and it's not hurting anyone. But to me, it doesn't feel as though it's a museum, because it's like, I think that you and I are doing different kind of work to source items. These people are, and kind of putting in the groundwork of finding the different sources. I don't think it would be sustainable to have a museum operational where all your items have just been purchased from other true crime sites. I think you need to be sourcing your own things, just from a fiscal sense, right? Because I don't think that it wouldn't make sense financially to just buy the stuff and put it on display, because you're not going to end up being able to break even on that. But the thing is that it's a conflict where it's like, it's not hurting anybody to, present it as if it's a museum or stuff, or whatever you want to call it, or your collection, your curation of things. Uh, uh, but at the same time, it's like, that line is sort of up to you as to what is a museum. I've had people call my apartment a museum, which I consider it just my office, right, for what I do, because I don't have people coming in and out and looking at my stuff. It's not out on public display. I think that a museum, I guess, if you're really trying to define it, is like, a public display of a collection of items that people have access to, whether they're paying for it or it's for free, nonprofit. It's that kind of public display of these things. um and I feel like another thing with that, and not to burst anyone's bubble, but I think that a lot of people have these kind of aspirations about eventually having a museum because they're interested in it. But I think it's sort of the same thing where, people who love video games sometimes want to work at a GameStop, and you realize, oh, it's just a fucking shitty retail job. And I love these things, that it's this thing I'm passionate about, but it doesn't actually make sense. People who love restaurants, who want to open a restaurant and open it and realize it's not successful and it's extremely hard work and you're not making any money. It has to be like a selfless thing where you're willing to lose and invest tons of money and work a ton and maybe have everything fall apart based on your passion for it. And if you want to do that, go right ahead. But I think you got to be realistic.
Right. And they always say that businesses, if they do collapse, it's usually within the first year. So you also have to take everything into consideration. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and they say you got to spend money to make money.
Yeah. I've seen people who've talked about, some a true crime event they're going to host, or a true crime museum, or this kind of thing, that kind of thing, and how much money they're going to make, and all these grand ideas about it. And it's like, that's great to be enthusiastic, but you have to be realistic, right? I think that these people are coming from a perspective of not running a small business. When, as you know, just because you would pay for something, or whatever, doesn't mean it would be successful. Like, for a few examples, I talked to somebody the other day who has a very good idea. I don't want to get into too many details of it, but it's a bit of a specific thing. It's a bit of a niche. It's one of those things where they've planned it out that they're hoping that maybe by 2028 they'll be able to have something going. And this isn't a way to make money or a successful thing. It's almost like a plan for a nonprofit organization. And they've got this extremely long and extremely expensive, for that matter, plan of how to get to that point. And it's a passion thing. They put a lot of work and time into it, but they have realistic expectations where, in 6 years, they're hoping maybe it will work for them. And with that long of a plan and that much time, knowing they're going to invest time and money into it, it seems very viable. I'm kind of behind it. I'm excited to get involved a bit and work in this project with them. But it's the most realistic point I've had, and they've done the work too, as opposed to somebody who has a couple designs for logos mapped out and they're like, cool, this is my thing and I'm going to make all this money. It's um shit, what was the other thing I was gonna say? Oh yeah. To kind of put it in perspective, right? Last month I started this cult member area on my site on Cult Collectibles, where it was like, hey, I'm gonna be buying specific items to display here, and I'll try and sell those things and break even. Like, I'm buying expensive items that are some Dahmer crime scene photos that nobody's seen before, a lot of Dahmer and Bundy letters that I've scanned. I've got a lot of videos up there, archival footage that I've preserved from VHS tapes. I've got like a specific member pricing. I've got free stickers. I've got exclusive merch, all these kind of perks and benefits. And it was sort of to move my Patreon over to my site, right? But I got so many things on display there now. It's almost like a digital museum in a way. And I set it up so people can pay $20 a month if they want to like support me a lot, or $6 a month if they just want to cover the minimum. In the first month, I had maybe 75 people sign up. And then right around the last few days have been the kind of renewal days. And I've had probably 40% of people cancel those subscriptions. And I've had maybe 15% the cards didn't get charged because they either changed their banking info or didn't have the funds on it and it didn't get renewed. So I've gone from like 70 to maybe 20 members, and which is, I'm not upset about it. It's fine, it happens. But if somebody's not willing to pay $6 twice to have access to things they're never going to ever be able to see anywhere else, they're not going to fly across the country or fly into Canada or whatever to come see a museum where the admission is going to be 20-30 bucks to see all this stuff, and it's just not viably going to work.
Right. I looked into it years ago. I was looking at, moving to Las Vegas and running a little museum out of an oddity shop, but the more and more I looked into it, like you have to pay, of course, your rent, obviously you got to pay your bills and everything on top of that. And if let's say you get like two or three people a day and you're charging 20-30 bucks, you're not even making overhead and
Mm-hmm.
rent. And it's like you put all this time, money, and effort into something just for it to crash and burn. And then you're ending up probably selling your most high end pieces to recoup and pick up the pieces in which you thought would do good.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense for certain people at certain levels. For that, let's use Zach Baggins as an example, right? For Vegas specifically, so he's got a haunted museum. Um, it works for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, he's got a ton of money, so if he loses money on that, it doesn't matter. He makes money on it, but if he was losing money, it wouldn't matter. Second of all, the guy's kind of a collector, right? He spends his money on these high-end items, paranormal artifacts. He has some true crime stuff, not a ton, but mostly paranormal things. But he's sort of curated this collection of high-end items. People know to go to him with things. He's made a name for himself where if you're going to sell something paranormal or even true crime to an extent, people are going to go to him because they know he has money to buy it. It's a huge attraction. He has a full staff there. Like, it's a massive, massive thing. I'm sure it costs millions a year in operational fees, and he makes a ton, I'm sure, but it's pretty expensive to go. Vegas is a huge tourist destination, so people are there anyway. Um, it makes sense for him, even if at the end of the year he breaks even, which I don't think is the case. But even if that happened, he's still able to curate these items to build his collection, to promote himself, to promote his shows, to sell merch, to do all these other things that have monetization is in place, and he's extremely famous, right? Whereas, for me, let's say I'm in Vancouver, let's say I rent uh, a small an office the size of my office here, a retail store, to have a little museum in, right? So I got to pay, probably where I am, it would probably be about $3,000 a month for rent. Then I need to pay insurance for all the items, and then insuring these things is a bit abstract. It's a bit difficult to insure things with kind of abstract values. I need to pay, either be there all the time for all the open hours, in which case I can't run the website, or I need to pay employees to be there. And you got to pay utility bills, you got to pay internet bills, you got to pay for a phone line for the place. The actual operation costs of having that place would be close to $10,000 a month as a very low estimate. And then I have to factor in the fact that theft is an issue, damage to items. I got to keep getting new things so people will want to come back again. I got to somehow advertise so people know to come look for the place. And with the money I make on my website in a month, like, I would be spending more than I make in a month to have this place operating. And it would basically be, let's throw more than the money I have and go into debt to start a business that's probably not going to make as much. Whereas with my site, the overhead costs for my website, are $300 a year for hosting fees. Obviously, I got to pay for shipping. I've got to pay for shipping supplies. I probably spend $2,000 to $3,000 a month in operational fees for my site now at the level I'm running. But it's because I put 5 years into this as a business and grown it and been strategic, right? Whereas just financially, it doesn't make sense. And especially people who are in smaller places, unless you're in, a really good example of this, a true world example, is that the Museum of Death in California was on Hollywood Boulevard, and they couldn't stay open. They're on the busiest tourist destination possibly in the world for foot traffic, and they couldn't stay open. They're trying to find a new location now. I assume it's something to do with how much it costs to be there, but yeah, it's in that spot you couldn't maintain your things. Like, it's like a bit of it's got to be a passion project, right? If I was retired and I wanted to have a place where people could come and hang out, and it was like my neat little thing, and I was spending money to operate it, sure, that would be fine. But people just because true crime is as popular as it is and people have the interests, it's still a niche thing. And it's still, even within that niche, a small amount of those people interested in it are going to want to actually see these physical items. It doesn't correlate the way people think it does. um yeah, it just doesn't work, unfortunately. I used to be do a lot of stuff with trading cards, buying and selling trading cards, and you see a lot of people who want to start their own card shop because they just love trading cards so much. And it's like, cool, well, you can your sell trading cards on eBay and make this much money, or you can run a store so that people are going to come in and hang out and play cards there, and you get to meet people and trade with people and see new things. But the only way you're going to actually make money there is if you're selling like snacks that people can eat there at a huge markup, because the actual cost of buying and selling the cards and the operational costs outweigh everything, right? You're not making money or getting successful unless the very small chance that you happen to be somebody who becomes this massive, massive success, and you're expanding and you have a business background. Um, but people with business backgrounds aren't getting into these hobby jobs. They're doing things that they know are more going to be more successful. And I don't want to shit on people or crush anyone's dreams. It just you have to be realistic about this stuff, and that um, just writing to inmates and buying things on the internet isn't going to curate you a museum, when there are people who are operating museums that have millions of dollars in budget every single year. Um, yeah, it just you got to be realistic.
Right. Yeah, I when I first started my Patreon, I had a tier, had it like a virtual true crime museum, but I changed that to a virtual true crime gallery because I didn't want, I guess, people like nitpicking at my words, whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
I do notice there's a lot of online true crime museums, which, like you said, it's more of like a gallery or just like your stuff that you have at home that you just have
Mm-hmm.
posted online, whatever. But there's not really that many true crime museums in the US, let alone the world. There's maybe what, like 20 or so. I mean, you've got like
Not even.
Alcatraz D, Zach Baggins Museum, and a couple more handful in the US. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's definitely a high risk, high reward kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's like when you're saying with that gallery thing too, right? Like, that's the thing, is that even with, I've kind of created a brand with Cult Collectibles, where it's more branded than some other true crime sites, in the sense that I've got merch and um it's a bit personality based and stuff. Not that anyone's doing anything bad, it's just a different approach that I had with it. And even then, I'll put a story up. I mean, I would before my Instagram was deleted, but when I had my large account, I put a story up saying, "Hey, I'm making this T-shirt. It's going to be $20 each. Please only say yes on this poll if you are certain you will actually pay for one, so I know what to order." And I would have, you know, 500 people say yes, I'll buy it 100% for sure. And I'd be like, cool, okay, well, I had 500 people order it. I'm going to order 25 shirts to be um, extremely cautious with it. And I put the 25 shirts up, and it would take 6 months to sell all 25. And then I get a message every 6 months saying, "Hey, do you still have this shirt?" And I'm like, "No, sorry, they're gone." Like, "Well, can you reprint it?" And it's like, "Well, I could reprint one for you, but it's going to cost $60. So I'm going to have to charge you $90. And even at that, I'm not going to make any money." And nobody wants to pay that. It's like, as it's a similar thing to back when you would make Facebook events, right? Let's say you're having a house party on Facebook and you invite 10,000 people, and then 1,000 people say they're gonna show up. And so, well, let's say 100 people say they're confirmed, 500 people say maybe, and everyone else says no, right? Of those 500 maybes, 0 people are going to be there. Of those 100 confirmed, 10 to 30 of those people are going to be there if you're lucky, right? It's just people don't have the follow through with certain stuff. As much as brand loyal as they are, people are very easily distracted and quickly have things where, oh, I'm excited about this, or I want this thing. The amount of I stopped doing payment plans recently because the amount of abandoned payment plans I have, where people have paid me like $1,000 and then don't make any more payments just because they lose interest, right? It's why I don't do them anymore. It's because, if somebody isn't going to have the patience to save $2,000 dollars from all the money they're getting paid and eventually pay it off. And they're trying to put a payment plan so that they can do it whenever they can scrounge the money together. They're not serious or enthusiastic about buying that item, right? So I often was putting things on hold for people who would never end up paying it all the way. And they want a refund because they changed their mind. And I would say to people, when I started payment plans, I don't do any refunds at all. You could pay me $1,900 out of $2,000. You're not going to get your item and you're not going to get a refund if you don't pay the whole thing, because I'm not just saving this money in a big pile here for you until you get the thing and then sending it to you. I'm spending the money. It's going into my business. And that item I could have sold for the full price without having to wait 6 months if I just listed it as it was. But I'm trying to give people the opportunity that if they want to do a payment plan, I'm going to trust that they are going to follow through, right? At a certain point, you kind of got to look at it as like a deposit for an item. And, you're going to lose your deposit if you can't pay it or if you decide you don't want it, because there's no benefit to me as a business taking that risk, when I could just sell the thing on my site. Yeah, it's just, and I hate to sound cynical, I'm venting a little bit, but it gets a little aggravating sometimes, the amount of times that people will, say, hey, I want to buy this thing. Let's say somebody says, I want to buy this item, I'll pay you for it right now, right? I'll say, great, set up a payment thing, send them a link. I would say 1 in 5 people actually pays and buys that item. And the other people say, okay, give me a couple of days. Or I've had people who've messaged me hundreds of times over years saying, oh, I'm really interested in this. Can you do a deal on it? I'll talk to them for an hour to figure out a deal. And they go, okay, let me get back to you in a few days. And they never buy it. It happens constantly. A majority of my sales, a majority of the conversations I have about sales, I should say, don't end in a sale. And it's my job, not my hobby. This is what I'm doing to make a living, right? So it happens and it's fine. I'm happy to talk to people about that stuff. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But people need to be realistic in their, it's like any business. I see a lot of times people start their own small business and then start posting all these memes about like, you got to support your friends' small businesses, da, 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 stop asking for freebies and shit, and have this really negative kind of feelings about it. And on the one hand, it's like I feel for those people, but on the other hand, it's like you had to be realistic going into this, knowing, listen, just because, so it's my warning to people, just because somebody says they're interested in it, or you think people are interested in it, or you think you have a good item or brand, or it could be successful, people aren't going to necessarily follow through the way that you think they are. And you have to be extremely cautious. I did this for 3 years part-time before I was confident enough to do it full-time, because it was just too much flakiness. You need the confidence behind people. Let me stop there because I'm ranting. But yeah, basically, I'm not trying to. But my point is, I'm trying not to shit on anybody or saying that your museum's not going to work, your store's not going to work, whatever. But from personal experience of 5 years of running a small business doing this, you have to set your expectations very low for what's going to happen with things and work hard to meet those low expectations. And hopefully you're successful, as opposed to having these high hopes and high expectations and putting the work in and then it doesn't work out and being disappointed. So the last thing, and I'll ask you first and then I'll go on about it, is that I used to get asked the most is, do you have any kind of weird energies or had any paranormal experiences from any of the items that you've had in your collection?
So I never have, and people always ask me that, and I always go back to this necklace that I got from Sarah Aldretti. There's supposedly a Nigerian man's spirit inside of it, and it was blessed by a witch doctor, yada yada yada. And I've worn it so many times. Like there was one time I was wearing it, which I chalked this up to a coincidence. I was wearing it, then like the part of the beads just like all of a sudden just fell off, like one by one, they just fell off. But I chalked that up to like it was like in a knot, or maybe I got it stuck on something or whatever. But I've never had any weird energy from anything I've had. Plus I have things from, dead serial killers, a Nazi war criminal. And I mean, you figure if there was, paranormal activity, I feel like somebody like you and I might feel it. But that's not to knock to say that other people don't have genuine experiences, with the stuff that they might have.
That's kind of my feelings towards it too. So, I mean, first off, I live across the street, like I'm looking at it right now, from like a 200-year-old funeral home where they did cremations for like 100 years, right? To me, something that doesn't make, and I don't think that's a haunted building. To me, it doesn't make sense that just because somebody who was dead was in a building means that something from that dead person is going to be there for some reason. Energy is going to attach to it. It never made sense to me. For instance, let's say Ted Bundy wrote a letter from prison So the spirits of people he killed are waiting to go into a letter that he wrote, and then he sends that, and then they're in there now, and that causes some energy. Um, I never personally had any kind of experience like that at all for negative energy or bad luck or paranormal stuff, but I was always open minded to maybe I'm somebody who isn't sensitive to these things because I'm desensitized to it. I've been around it too much. And I'm going to chalk that up to either A, maybe some people have a better awareness of that kind of stuff, or B, maybe some people want to feel that way and therefore they are manifesting it themselves. I'm 100% neutral on it, right? Like I have no opinion either way as to whether or not any of it is real or not. But I got in touch with these people locally who are on paranormal investigation team or a group, I guess, and then they put me in touch with these YouTubers who also do that kind of stuff. And then we sort of planned for a few months getting this thing together where they would all come by and look at some items. And they came by a while ago. I'm actually recording a podcast tonight with them to kind of go over some of the results they found. And then we're going to do a video together in person and kind of put out this little mini documentary on it. That's going to be really cool. But it was basically like, hey, here's all this stuff that's connected with dark people and evil people. Let's see if we can find some kind of correlation here or some kind of energy or some kind of interesting thing. Um, yeah, and I didn't necessarily believe anything would happen. There was some interesting stuff that took place when we did that, but you could chalk it up to 1,000 different things that aren't paranormal or paranormal stuff. I'm not I'm skeptical, but I'm not against any kind of idea about it, right? But to me, what doesn't make sense, I think the thing that people think is, oh well, John Wayne Gacy painted this painting, therefore it's haunted. It's like, well, but how would it become haunted? What it like the logic of it? I know this is obviously an illogical kind of topic, but the logic of it is okay. So we killed 33 boys, and then the 33 boys were waiting in his body until he painted the painting, so they could jump their energy into the painting. Then he sold that painting, and now their ghosts are in the painting. But he did hundreds of paintings in hundreds of different places. But maybe that's me looking at it from perspective of that isn't how it works, where one spirit is attached to one item. Maybe it's a matter of like different energies being in different things. Um, like I'm very appreciative of the people coming by and what we looked into, uh, because it was like, well, they're going to feel something differently, maybe. And then I had all the people when they came in were very much like, oh, I feel an energy in here, a different energy. Then I kind of chalk it up to, okay, is that because you're in tune with this stuff or because you know what I have in my apartment before you got here, right? And you have predisposed feelings towards it. And well, like I said, once again, I'm not trying to be critical of it at all. I just personally don't have a connection or understanding of that world in the least bit. So I've chalked it up to the experts, right? They're looking at it and they're gonna see, and then I'm gonna report those results back online for anybody who's curious, right? It might change my mind on how I feel about it. It might not, but the point is just to have an outsider perspective, like in the same way that if I get an item I don't know anything about, I'm going to take it to an expert who deals in Manson items or this item or that item. Say, hey, what do you think about this before I pull the trigger on it? Because I don't have the experience to understand properly what is going on. So as a quick note at the end here, so we had Andrew got a lot of questions on a few platforms. I had a good list on my Instagram. Those are the ones that kind of stuck out to me that I remember. A lot of them were also questions that you got asked that would have been just redundant. But my Instagram got deleted a couple of days after I made that post before I could save any of those and keep track of it. So if there were any that I missed on there, I apologize. But I feel like there's a lot to be asked about this stuff. There's a lot of people have a lot of a lot of curiosity about the stuff. So I mean, I would say like we probably, I think it would be good to do another Q&A video in the future when we have enough stuff compiled that isn't redundant, where, because even a lot of the questions we talked about this time, we've talked about previously in other episodes, and this kind of compiles it all together. So I'm definitely like the idea of actively kind of making a note of interesting questions or unique questions, and then doing something again in the future, because there's always going to be people who are curious about asking more stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. So if anybody that's listening has any more questions, feel free to message myself or Taylor or
Mm-hmm.
leave a comment on Murderabilia Exposed. and then we
Mhm.
can do it again in the future.
Yeah, and just in case so Cult Collectibles got banned on Instagram. Then it was Cult Collectibles 604 banned recently. Now it's True Cult Collectibles. It's not going to last long. And I've gone from like 5,000 followers to like 200, and which is fine. Most of the people that follow my stuff do it through cultcollectibles.org. So if you need to reach out to me, go to cultcollectibles.org. There's contact info, email admin@cultcollectibles.org. That's the number one way to keep in touch. If we lost a conversation in the DMs or whatever, or you haven't heard from me, I didn't ghost anybody. I just Instagram always takes my stuff down, but at the same time, it's the easiest platform for me to use to talk to people, aside from just direct through email. So yeah, that's just the only update on my end.
All right. Well, I think we can get out of here. We
Beautiful.
can do this again in the future. And yeah, again, if anybody has any more questions, feel free to DM myself or Taylor.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.